Octavia Hill made an enormous contribution to social reform in Britain. She was really a pioneer in terms of housing and welfare and charity.
She was also a pioneer of what was called the open spaces movement, which we would now call the environmental movement.
She didn't have a fantastic education, and yet she made a remarkable change on people's lives. And I think there's a lot to be learnt from that today too.
Octavia Hill's era in London was a time of great riches, but also incredible poverty. You'd have overhousing, ill health, unemployment, and that was Octavia Hill's inspiration. She was determined to try and solve those kind of big social problems.
Octavia Hill's grandfather was a man called Thomas Southwood Smith, who was a pioneer of what was known as the sanitary reform movement. It meant very basic things like building drains and sewers and providing medical care to fight infectious diseases, which at that time were endemic in city life.
Look at the appalling conditions that people were living in. Babies, no chance of survival because you had raw sewage running down the street. So she had a tremendously strong family heritage.
And her grandfather was a member of the very first Board of Health. Octavia worked with him when she was a little girl, and she helped him on some of his campaigns. For example, the campaign to stop children from going down the mines.
When she went into an area that was a red light area, children having absolutely no proper housing at all, windows broken, dirty, filthy places.
You have to remember that it was before the welfare state, so there was lots of slum housing, there was no safety net for people.
In Notting Hill, a notorious area of squalid housing, the number of children who died within a year of giving birth reached 50% in the last century. Now that's the kind of conditions that just going out and handing out a little bit of money and encouraging people to go to church wasn't going to change. And Octavia Hill knew that, and knew that you actually had to campaign to change the laws, to change policies, to make people listen.
And she went in there and said, we can turn this round, but I can only do it with your help.
The basement of Octavia Hill House has been recreated to represent living conditions at the time that Octavia acquired from Ruskin houses to manage in London.
Octavia Hill started working in housing because she was inspired by John Ruskin, who was a social reformer at the time. And what he did was he bought 6 houses in a slum area called Paradise Place, which is just down the road here in Marylebone, and he gave those to Octavia Hill to manage.
She was meticulous in money matters. People should pay their rent. There should be no arrears, but that in return for that their property would be well maintained.
And she said to the tenants, if you don't look after this, you're out. That might sound pretty hard to some liberal-minded thinking people, but actually it was all about taking responsibility for your own lives.
Social housing can mean slightly different things in different places, but it's usually taken to mean housing that's got a certain amount of government subsidy. When I was first asked to speak about Octavia Hill, I was a little wary about it because I feel that in many ways her impact on housing was fairly pernicious. It was a very Victorian characteristic, dividing the deserving and undeserving poor. People had to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps.
Octavia Hill's social ethos we might find a little bit harsh today, but her guiding idea was that the only way you help the poor is to help them help themselves.
As far as developments are concerned, she liked small-scale developments, not vast estates as one would see them today.
Octavia Hill actually argued very strongly against the flat building that was happening in her time, so she would obviously have hated there's even taller flats behind us. Though I have to say I think she'd probably have approved of the people who've planted flowers along their balconies, because one of the things she liked to do was get her tenants, and they were very much in her mind her tenants, to do flower arranging. She used to teach them all the middle class virtues.
She preferred small developments where people could get to know one another, and it was a small community affair.
Though originally it was about housing, the more she got steeped into the community, she realised it wasn't just about providing a house or a flat.
So she wanted to provide a social life, a civic life. She wanted open spaces like where we are in Regent's Park. She wanted art galleries and museums.
People had to have a wider perspective on life, and she became one of the founders of something called Open Spaces, which is still active today, which meant that people needed more than just bricks and mortar around them.
And Octavia Hill's argument was that the kind of open spaces which the rich enjoy in their big gardens, their country estates, should actually be available to the majority of the population in urban areas.
She took a crowd of the kids from the slums up to Hampstead Heath, and they were terrified. They thought the woods were the jungle. They thought the jungle had lions and animals in it that were going to eat them, because they'd never been in woods before. They'd never seen the heath, hills or mountains or anything like that.
So on the one hand, she'd opened up Hampstead Heath and other places to the people, and on the other hand, she wanted to constrain the growth of London.
I think it was important, the work that Octavia did to help preserve open spaces within London and in the foundation of the National Trust. I think where she was very misguided was the idea that so many people could live in London in little cottages with gardens around, because clearly with a city this size it just wouldn't work.
People who criticise Octavia say, well, it was all so small, it wouldn't have worked for the larger society. But Octavia's answer to that was, if lots of people would do these small projects, we wouldn't need the state to step in and do it all on a much larger scale, where you lose the personal touch. The Red Cross development in Southwark really sums up everything Octavia was about, because it brings together all her interests. There are the cottages, where she provided housing, the gardens to provide an open space, and the Red Cross Hall.
Living here is very beautiful, the garden's beautiful, and we've enjoyed our life since we've been married, just after the war.
45 years we've lived here.
Yeah, I said 40,
and we've been,
yeah.
Oh, you always get it wrong.
Yeah, I always get it wrong. When I joined up, I was 17 and a half. I was wounded twice, 1941 and 1942 I was wounded again. After the war, I was living with my sister for quite a while, but it was hard because there's only one room I was in. And then after that, it was looking around all the time, you couldn't find them. Only through Octavia Association that I managed to get a place, and I find it very nice to live here, where anybody else would like it here.
Green space is brilliant.
Yeah, this is what you want, isn't it?
Yeah.
And fresh air, open space.
Plenty of flowers.
We restored this garden from Heritage Lottery funding a couple of years ago and tried to create the same function Octavia Hill intended for it. She laid out this garden in 1887, and that time, just like today, there was not much open space in this area. So we recreated the same layout of the garden and also tried to involve local residents in looking after the garden.
This young lady helps Agnes. Now and again. Because we're elderly, aren't we? So you can't do too much.
You don't help.
I try.
I think some people are living in a big city or don't have a sense of belonging anymore. So people are very proud of being part of this. Even if it's full with people like today, it's such a quiet, tranquil little oasis in central London. And I think it gives such a peace of mind for people to come here and refresh themselves.
No, this is beautiful.
Yeah, they were happy here.
For most of the last century, people have been trying to build up social housing, build up specifically council housing. And then since Margaret Thatcher came in the 1980s, there's been an attack on council housing and increasingly trying to push people more and more into home ownership, whether or not they can afford it.
I think Octavia Hill would be quite disappointed by some elements of housing today.
I think Octavia would have been absolutely shocked to think that all these years after her lifetime, there were still people living in pretty poor conditions.
When I go into some of the houses and I see families, mum and dad and maybe 3 children sharing a single bedroom flat, might not be as bad as it was in Victorian times, but it really isn't good enough for a country like Britain in the 21st century.
If Octavia Hill was alive today, I think she'd be contributing in a quite similar way. She wouldn't be a bureaucrat in central government.
I rather suspect she'd be there at the front with the banner, demonstrating and campaigning to say this is unacceptable. She would probably be a pain to any government in power, and that would be good.
She'd be working on the ground, she'd be working in communities, rather like the Octavia Hill Foundation still does today.
All our work is really based on what Octavia Hill's legacy is, because the social conditions that existed in the 19th century, although London in the 21st century is very different, poverty and disadvantage are still very much in evidence. And what we do is we work with all communities so that we can bring communities together and combat the effects of poverty and disadvantage.
The most obvious legacy of Octavia Hill's work now is the environmental movement, which is now very influential, it's very large, everyone is concerned about the environment, plays a big part in public policy.
Was Octavia a pioneer? In some ways, yes. She certainly worked with poorer people than many of her contemporaries did. In some ways, she was very backward-looking. She was looking backwards to try and recreate in London a sort of idealised vision of a squire meeting his peasants in the country. She liked to think of herself as a friend of her tenants, but that was probably not the light that her tenants saw her in.
She left the view behind that actually you're not an individual in that sense. You're an individual that can achieve, but you owe it to society and community to work together with other people.
It's very important to remember historical figures, to see how their ideas can work on us today. The problem with modern society is we think we know everything, but you look back 100 years and you realise how little you do know.
She shows that it is possible to do things that will improve the quality of other people's lives, improve the quality of the community's life, even if you feel you're not a very influential person, you're not very rich, you don't know lots of powerful people. There are always things you can do.
What station in life you're born into and what assets that you may have cannot dictate your whole life if you don't want them to.
Octavia Hill's been my life, really, because if it wasn't for her and the training under her principles, which I did when I was a teenager, which led me into the profession of housing management. So I owe a lot to Octavia. Great lady.
Octavia Hill's been a massive influence for me personally, because she was a very strong woman at a time when women were very much in the background. It's really a great role that I have to be able to promote Octavia's work through the work of the Octavia Foundation.
Through a horticultural society, I've got a rose that they call Octavia Hill, and it is the most exquisite, beautiful pink rose. And I think if she saw that, she'd think, I was nothing like that. But that's how I see her.
Octavia Hill's legacy will be remembered as one of the pioneering female philanthropists and social activists in London's history and Britain's history, and her legacy in numerous housing estates in the open air of Hampstead Heath will be remembered for many years to come.